So today is the 11th of November 2012, Remembrance Sunday. For those of you who aren't familiar, Remembrance Sunday is a day in which you remember the fallen of two world wars and every war succeeding that. And in the United Kingdom, in Commonwealth countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and I think maybe in the United States, you will see a lot of people marking this day. I think in the US it's called Veterans Day, but some of my American viewers can maybe confirm that. And you'll notice a lot of people wearing the red poppy. I might make another video today more specifically about that, but that's to remember the millions who were killed and injured in two world wars and subsequent wars. And the reason it's on this date is the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, ending the First World War. I'd like to just focus a little bit in this video about a subject that's not really been touched on as much as I think it should. I've just been watching a BBC film based on the Catherine Cookson novel The Cinder Path. That's set at the time of World War I. And in the story, at one point, the main character is in Newcastle, and he's in the street basically, and two women come up and approach him and hand him a white feather. And one of them says, "I've got a son at the front. You're a strapping young man. Why aren't you out there?" etc., etc. One of his military friends intervenes and says, "Actually, this guy runs a farm, a large farm, and that very farm is producing the sort of dairy produce that feeds you two women and the rest of the population." So basically that scene was interesting because the women were trying to shame him into going into the front by implying he was a coward, but they're ignoring the fact that actually his livelihood is essential for the good of the nation, in the sense that farming is an essential industry to feed people, especially back then when, you know, we didn't get trade from other countries as fast as we would today, and so farming was essential. A bit like mining. There were reserved occupations whereby men didn't have to serve up, and some of them were mining, farming, and there were some male jobs that women took up, but that was more World War II. For example, World War II, women took on sort of farming jobs and so on. Anyway, I'd like to touch on some things which is interesting about this scene. Firstly, the whole white feather campaign was instituted by a group of people who felt that it was an essential part of the war effort to basically name and shame those young men they felt should have been on the front and for whatever reason weren't. And those that weren't came under a whole lot of different banners. I'm talking about people of military age here. Either they were in a reserve occupation, they were conscientious objectors in some cases. There was a range of reasons why they weren't on the front. This white feather campaign was designed as an essential part of the propaganda machine, or the recruiting machine, to shame young men into going, especially, and the fact that it was presented by women, not other men, was a key part of this shaming, as if to say that they're not real men, they're not fighting for God, king and country. They also use women very much in the propaganda, like, will you let the German Hun do this to our wives or mothers or sisters? So, socially speaking, it was a very, very interesting time, very bitter time in many ways. I think in some ways World War I was a lot worse than World War II for Britain. I'm not talking about in terms of casualties or anything like that, although casualties were enormous. I'm talking also about this social aspect. There were definitely different dynamics to World War II. World War I was a very, very ugly war. And without a shadow of a doubt, there were hundreds, thousands of young men literally driven to their death. There's a 1960s satirical film called Oh What a Lovely War, and at the start of that they show sort of the cabaret type singer, music hall singer, where she's singing about we don't want to lose you, but you have to face the powder. Whereby basically these young men, not always young men, we always speak about young men, it was men in their 30s and 40s as well, literally driven to their death in their thousands. And yes, it's true, a lot of young men were enthusiastic about joining up because of the sort of propaganda that was around in 1914 and the fanatical patriotism. But there are those who were more wary about it. In fact, the last veteran of World War One to die, a British veteran, Harry Patch, who became quite a well-known figure, he died at the age of 111 in 2010. He always said that from the start he was never very enthusiastic about the war. His older brother had joined up. I think he'd been killed. But Harry Patch was a fireman, I think, by trade. And he was never enthusiastic about joining up. Or he may have been a farmhand actually, but he had different jobs throughout life. But this comes into a social dynamic about feminism at that time. Now, I've always defended the early feminist movement. I believe it was necessary because women were fighting for the basic right to vote, which is a basic human right. And I still believe that early feminist movement was important. However, I'd like to point out one hypocrisy that feminists have never really addressed, and that is this claim of constant victimhood, female victimhood versus so-called male privilege. Well, male privilege, I have one response to that. World War One. Okay? The vast majority of casualties on the Western Front were men. That's just a fact. Yes, there were some female victims from, for example, munitions explosions in factories and a few Zeppelin raids. The Spanish flu, if you include that. But generally speaking, the vast majority of victims of World War One on the Western Front were men. Different on the Eastern Front because that included very controversial issues about genocide and so on. But on the Western Front, the vast majority of victims were men. So, for an upper class feminist like Emmeline Pankhurst to talk about male privilege is despicable. And she's often lauded as a great hero. I still think she's a significant figure. But Emmeline Pankhurst has blood on her hands for enthusiastically supporting the White Feather campaign. An interesting thing was the women's suffrage movement split at that time. There was those suffragists like Emmeline Pankhurst who were active members of the Conservative Party, or at least sympathetic to the Conservative Party. They openly supported the White Feather campaign. And then there were socialist suffragettes who were staunchly against the war, to their credit. And I do give them credit because they condemned the war, they condemned the fact that thousands of young men were being killed. So the feminist movement split at that time. But not enough feminists have condemned Emmeline Pankhurst for her role in sending a lot of young men to their deaths. Yes, there was men involved in that as well, like Lord Kitchener and so on. But the point is that completely flies in the face of male privilege. When they were conscripted, they had no choice. In many cases, they were from poor backgrounds, northern mining towns, northern mill towns, lived remote were all over the country. But that just flies in the face of the claim of male privilege. They were used as cannon fodder, 18-year-old boys. And, when we talk about this whole issue about cowardice, that in itself is an interesting area to explore. I wouldn't blame a young man for having fear about facing the trenches of the Great War, knowing their chances of being killed, basically being set up to be used as cannon fodder. Can anyone really blame him for being frightened? So this whole notion of cowardice gets thrown around a lot as well. What I'm trying to say is, if they were frightened, who can blame them? But actually, in most cases, that wasn't the case. In some cases, they were handed white feathers when they were actually on leave, when they were doing other jobs such as mining or, other manual jobs. So this white feather campaign was a dark chapter in our history, as far as I'm concerned, and it directly led to a lot of young men being killed. Another interesting scene where they show the white feather thing was in the film All the King's Men, BBC film, starring David Jason, about the Gallipoli campaign. In that, it shows this mob attacking a man's house, and smashing his windows and stuff, claiming that he was a coward because he wasn't on the front. What these women were essentially saying is that unless you get turned into smithereens by machine gun fire, then you're not a real man, and it's quite despicable, that sort of mindset. And it wasn't just in Britain. I'm sure this was exactly the same on the other side. I'm sure young German men were shamed as well, and young Turkish men and young Italian men, and basically millions of men all over Europe were sent to their deaths in this horrible war. The way I see it, the further back it goes in time, the better. It was an unnecessary war, in my opinion. World War II was more of a just war, still a terrible war, but more of a just cause. But I believe it's important to raise this issue on the 11th of November. I'll put a link actually to an interesting video I came across specifically about Emmeline Pankhurst. She actually put aside the women's suffrage movement for the 4 years of World War I so she could support the war effort and basically campaign in this white feather campaign, which was despicable. And her apologists should remember that. I'm not saying it's just her. I'm not saying feminists are responsible for World War I. I'm not saying that for a second. It was imperialistic ambitions that were responsible for World War I, among other issues. But it was there's absolutely no question about it. Those feminists who backed the war effort had blood on their hands. And you know, it's awful to think that young men were sacrificed because they felt they had something to prove. It's tragic. In their hundreds of thousands. I mean, in the first battle on the Western Front at Mons, I believe more men were killed than in half of all Victorian wars combined, something like that. In the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 19,000 British soldiers were killed. Those sort of statistics are just overwhelming. And you know, World War I is almost unprecedented in the history for that sort of mass slaughter, particularly of specific areas. There have been worse wars in history in terms of overall death toll, but in some ways World War I was the ugliest war. We also see those terrible images of shell-shock victims horribly maimed, and it was a horrible, horrible war. World War I was like Britain's Vietnam. In fact, that's a bad analogy because it came first and it was worse, so it's better to say Vietnam was America's World War I, because the sheer number of fatalities, and it's horrible. So on this 11th of November, I'd just like to challenge that claim of male privilege that feminists always like to put forward, because that absolutely flies in the face of that. I think it's fair to say that it was partly a result of patriarchy. That's a fair enough claim, but in that case then men were largely victims of patriarchy. Feminists do acknowledge that, but this is an example of the claim of female privilege versus male privilege just being completely rubbish, because these guys didn't have any privileges. They were used as cannon fodder, and Emmeline Pankhurst and co had blood on their hands for the shameful campaign. And on this 11th of November, I just hope, in a sort of sentimental way, that everyone who were victims of that war, all the young men killed at the front, men who perhaps took their own lives through the pressure they faced on the home front, all of them, I hope they can find, I hope they rest at peace forever. So that's just some thoughts on the white feather phenomenon. Okay, thank you. I'll include a link, by the way, to that video I came across.